Affinity spaces can be found in various forms across countless domains of human social activity, and groups of all different sizes are drawn together by what inspires them to passion. One such passion is the creation and performance of live music. Though there are a few spaces connected with live music performance that could be considered affinity spaces, we'll focus on just one, the rehearsal. Live music, like most types of performance art, requires rehearsal that takes up much more time than the actual performance. Musicians are drawn together via their common interest and begin to use the space to generate musical content of their own. Though the goal of rehearsal, which is to learn and improve music to be performed later, remains largely the same across genres, different types of ensembles exhibit these characteristics in different ways. For example, in an orchestra, the primary generator of the content is usually the composer of the work, who may not be present or even still alive at the time of rehearsal. Other types of music, however, emphasize the collaboration of participants, and the role of generator changes between, or is shared by, more than one person. The type of music being rehearsed is a good indication of the ability of affinity space participants to generate and transform content, and smaller groups not associated with academic or professional music tend to feature less distinction between masters and newbies. In most rehearsal settings, the role of master is typically associated with teaching newbies. Since the range of rehearsal types varies so widely across different styles of music, it is instructive to narrow the focus of this investigation to one specific type, the rock band rehearsal. The content being generated is the music itself. In this type of rehearsal, participants in the affinity space typically share the role of generator of content equitably, or sometimes with one or more members of the band bearing the brunt of the songwriting responsibility. Often, the generators of musical content within a band tend to be the masters, with those having to learn the songs being closer to the newbie end of the spectrum, but this is not always the case. Equally often, these lines are blurred, and all members act as generators to some extent. It is in this manner that even newbies can transform content, either by spontaneous musical expression on their particular instrument, or simply by making their musical opinions heard in the rehearsal process. It should be noted, however, that in these types of ensembles, the divide between relative masters and newbies is typically not wide, as players of similar skill tend to form groups with one another. There are various portals utilized by members of a band at a rehearsal. In some ways, the musical instrument that the band member plays can be considered a sort of multimodal portal. The instruments allow the musicians direct contact with the musical content being generated, and also allow them to fill the role of generator. Often, the type of instrument played by a given band member indicates the role that individual takes in the rehearsal process. Another common portal is pre-recorded music, either of the band itself or of another musician or ensemble, which the band might use in rehearsal to learn a song, suggest changes, or attempt to pick up on a particular musical technique. This portal can be equally multimodal and can constitute digital music, accessed via the internet or some kind of digital music player, or physical copies of music such as vinyl records, which are of course outnumbered today by compact discs. Other common portals include those which facilitate communication among band members. These portals take several forms, from musical notation on lead sheets and chord charts to organizational efforts such as smartphone apps like Trello, Evernote, and Band, which, as the name suggests, was originally designed specifically for bands. Old literacy does still play a role, however, and many bands rely on visual aids rendered in print to share and edit ideas. Rehearsing music is an activity that, though it may be supplemented by newer forms of literacy, still requires face-to-face human interaction in most cases. Being a member of a rock band entails many different types of learning and proliferation of content knowledge. Though it's certainly true that the distributed knowledge of all members of the band is what constitutes the group's ability as a whole, much of this learning is self-directed. In most rock band rehearsals, especially at the professional level, musicians are expected to learn the music before the rehearsal begins, so rehearsal time can be used to work out fine details. Learning in this affinity space could be considered self-directed in a deeper sense as well. Membership in one of these groups typically requires a certain amount of skill on an instrument, which takes a lot of individual practice. Several of the features of a rock band rehearsal that suggest it is an affinity space are unsuitable for implementation in a classroom, and a classroom as it is currently known cannot become an affinity space without significant change. However, some elements of the rock band rehearsal are useful in examining small changes that could be made in a classroom setting that stimulate the kind of deep learning that does so often occur in actual affinity spaces. One aspect of rock rehearsals that could be implemented in schools is a more egalitarian balance of power between masters and newbies. In a band, more knowledge usually constitutes a heavier influence on the direction of the band, but does not preclude the influence of members with less knowledge. The focus in a band is to see what collaboration between individuals of different skill can allow all of them to learn. This is in contrast to traditional teaching settings, in which the teacher, as the master and generator of content, has absolute control over the learning process. Another way that a rock band rehearsal could serve as a model for classroom learning is the size of the group. It would of course be impossible for most schools to have classes of 3 to 7 students, but the type of learning that occurs in small groups driven towards a common purpose can be much more powerful than the learning that can occur simply by having students listen to a teacher in a large group, usually without talking. This is a continuation of the idea that affinity spaces are successful because the willing and passionate collaboration of their members. Schools can't guarantee shared passion, but perhaps combining students in collaborative groups based on interests and tailoring curriculum that still meets standards to those groups' specific needs could spark the passion for learning in students. Finally, schools could take an example from rock bands by emphasizing the final result of the learning process. Too often, students aren't motivated to learn because they see nothing in it for themselves, and assessments like standardized tests are hardly effective motivators for most students. In a band, all the rehearsal time is in preparation for the performance, which can be thought of as an authentic assessment of musical content knowledge by the band. They are simultaneously assessed collectively and individually. This is not to suggest a Jack Blackian School of Rock type situation, but classrooms could definitely take a few hints from the authenticity and commitment to deep learning that rock bands utilize.